redistricting. Senator Hall is here. Where is he here? You can sit where. Yeah, we have some visitors today, and we have several senators online, which are good to see. And we'll get started today, as we usually do today. Of course, we're doing focusing on Dallas-Fort Worth area, but we will get started as we have done every hearing to have an update on that area from Dr. Potter. Dr. Potter, you're recognized to get started.
Good morning, Madam Chair. It's good to be with you again. And my name is Lloyd Potter. I'm the Texas State Demographer and the Director of the Texas Demographic Center. We serve as a resource for the House and the Texas House and Senate, the Governor's Office, state agencies, and the public regarding issues related to our population. I'm going to go through and talk a little bit about the census because that's at the basis of the redistricting effort. So there are three major functions of the census. The first has to do with, and really why it's embedded in our Constitution, is for reapportionment of U.S. House seats across states. So essentially, as the population grows differentially across the United States, the number of seats in the U.S. Congress have to be redistributed to ensure there's equal representation across states. The second purpose is for redistricting or redrawing the districts, as I was just mentioning, for U.S. House seats, but then also for the Texas House and Senate seats, for school board seats, for a range of districts across the state. And then the third function is the census becomes the basis for redistribution of tax dollars that we send to Washington come back to the state in the form of programs for healthcare, education, transportation, and so on. There are some important dates for redistricting. The first is when the apportionment file is sent to the president. Historically and actually by law, it's to be sent by December 31st following the completion of the census. Because of the pandemic, that has been delayed. And so now the Census Bureau is targeting April 30th of this year to deliver the apportionment file. That will determine how many U.S. congressional seats Texas is likely to gain. And then the redistricting file is traditionally delivered by April 1st in the year following the census. And now again, because of the pandemic, there's been a delay in both data collection and processing of census data. And currently the estimate is that sometime after July 31st, of this year, the redistricting data file will be delivered. Historically, Texas has received that file in the first round because the Census Bureau has historically delivered the redistricting file on a weekly basis to on 8 states at a time. And so Texas has traditionally been at the beginning of that. Largely because you all are in session usually when the data are released. Now, because the session will be over, we don't know exactly what the Census Bureau's plan is in terms of releasing Texas at the beginning, the middle, or the end of their flow of releasing of the redistricting file. When the file is released, though, it has information about the race and ethnicity of the population down to a pretty small level of geography, which is the block level. And it has information about the population that's age 18 years of age and older, and information about occupancy status of housing units, and then information about group quarters, which are living arrangements such as long-term care, nursing homes, prisons, dormitories, and so on. After the data for the redistricting file are delivered to government officials in the state, the Census Bureau will post the data on their website, and it's available to the public at this URL that's listed here on this slide. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about population change so far this decade. And here you can see that Texas has, the Census Bureau has estimated Texas population as of 2020. This is not the census count. This is just a part of the Census Bureau's regular process of producing population estimates. It's not a count. But they estimate the Texas population to be 29,360,759 as of July 1st of 2020. If that's our true population, then Texas will have added 4,215,198 Texans over the decade, and that's more than any other state has added. Texas is also growing faster than all other states except for Utah, growing at almost 17% over the decade. Utah is growing a little bit faster, but it's also a much smaller state. If all this holds to be true and the population counts for all of the other states are consistent with this, we forecast that Texas will get 3 new U.S. congressional seats. I've seen estimates of 2, but most of the estimates I've seen are 3, and that's consistent with our estimate as well. When we look at population change over the decade, I'm showing you here 2 different but certainly similar approaches to estimating the population. The dark blue column are the Texas Demographic Center's population projections. Our projections would have the Texas population at 29,677,000. The Census Bureau estimate that I just mentioned at 29,360. And so once we know what the population actually is, that is when the census apportionment file is released, we'll take that number and essentially divide the number of districts that we're redistricting into that number to identify the ideal size of a district. In the case of Texas Senate districts, if we divide the number of Senate districts into these numbers, the ideal size for the Census Bureau estimate would be 947,000. That's the ideal size of the Senate district. And if our number, the projection for from the Texas Demographic Center is the number, it would be 957,000. And so the goal then for redistricting, and that I should then say, if we have 39 seats in the U.S. Congress, these are the ideal sizes of the districts using the same number. And so the idea here for redistricting is if a current district has gained population and exceeds this threshold, the senators and representatives who are doing redistricting will have to then reduce the geographic size of that district to bring the population in it down to this threshold number. So areas that have been growing very quickly, that's where that's likely to happen. There are parts of the state that have lost population, and so some parts of the state will end up being below this threshold. And then the challenge is to geographically grow the district to incorporate additional people to bring the population up to this threshold. So that's the basic idea and process behind redistricting, and it really has to do with population change over time and then readjusting the districts to ensure there's by and large equal representation across the area that's being served. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the population change across the state. You can see here this is looking at population change at the county level, and we've overlaid current Senate districts over this. If you look at the population triangle of San Antonio, Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston, you can see that's where a lot of population growth has occurred, especially in these urban core counties. And I think it probably would even put Collin County more or less into an urban core county. It certainly has grown a lot. But if you look at the lower Rio Grande Valley, we've seen pretty significant growth. The urbanized areas in the Permanent Basin, the Lubbock area, Amarillo, and El Paso have all grown pretty significantly. And so, again, if you're thinking about what I was just talking about, it's those urbanized areas where we've seen dramatic population growth, where we're likely to see some of the current districts, their population exceeding the threshold once that's been determined, and then there will be a need for those to be drawn slightly smaller and smaller to get down to the threshold. And certainly today we're focused on the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and you can see there's been tremendous growth in this part of the state. And so if you zoom in here, this is looking at our projected population change, and you can see certainly Tarrant, Dallas, Collin County, and Denton all have added over 100,000 people over the decade. But, very significant growth in all of the counties surrounding these urban core counties and the rapidly growing counties in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Now I'm showing you percent change, and this is an indication of the speed of change. If we look at sparsely populated counties, here's Loving County. If Loving County adds 15, 20 people, its percent change is going to be high because its population base is small. But if we look at, for example, Collin County or Denton County, those counties have large population bases and they're still growing very quickly, which means they're adding a lot of people. And we can see similar things in the suburban ring counties around the San Antonio, Austin area, and in the Houston area as well. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about a more granular way of looking at population change. And this is looking at census tracts and proposed changes for census tracts following the 2020 census. When we look at the purple lines here and the red ones, those indicate the census tracts in 2010, following the 2010 census. The blue lines that we see here are referring to the proposed census tract splits. An ideal size of a census tract is 4,000 people. If a census tract gets above 8,000 people, the Census Bureau then splits that census tract into two, so that you'd have two census tracts of about the ideal size of 4,000 people. If a census tract goes below 2,500 people, the Census Bureau will look to take that census tract and combine it with another one to bring that closer to the ideal count of 4,000. And so here's looking at the state, but now I'm going to zoom into the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And certainly you can see a few areas where they're proposing redrawing some of when you see the red lines, that's suggesting combining census tracts. But predominantly what you're seeing here, in addition to the purple lines, which are the 2010 census tracts, are a lot of blue lines. And those blue lines are suggesting the population has grown pretty rapidly at these relatively small areas of geography. And again, if you look at the density of the population in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the amount of growth that we've seen in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, there will be some challenges here to draw the districts smaller and smaller to bring the population down to the ideal size of a district. The population in Texas has changed fairly significantly by race and ethnicity. Here we're looking at trends for the different race ethnic groups. The second line down is the Latino population, and you can see it's almost at parity with the non-Hispanic white population in 2020. Our forecast is at the end of this current year or sometime in 2022, the Latino population will meet and then exceed the size of the non-Hispanic white population. Another population that's grown pretty dramatically is the Asian population. Even though as a percentage of the total population, it's small, its growth has been pretty dramatic, and it's made significant contributions to our population change in the state this decade. Here we're looking at population, the contribution of different race ethnic groups to the population change over the decade. And we see that over 50% of the population change can be attributed to growth of the Hispanic population. Almost 15% to growth of the African American population. And interestingly, as I was just referring to the growth of the Asian population, almost 13% of our population change can be attributed to that race ethnic group. And then the non-Hispanic white population adding almost 16.5%. But if we look at all of the minority populations and add those together as percentage, it's over 83% of our population change has been driven by growth of minority population. Now I'm just going to talk about some resources. One is the Texas Demographic Center has put together a redistricting resources with a focus on Senate districts. And you can see if you went to our website and looked at the data tab, and then saw the Census 2020 tab, you'd see redistricting resources. Click on that and it would pull this up. It would give you some information about trends that we've seen in a slide deck that we have here, and then a map of numeric change across counties. But then we have information for each Senate district here, showing population change in maps, tables, and then we have a narrative. The narrative here would be we're looking at Bexar County. I actually had intended to put a Dallas-Fort Worth one in here, but I guess I missed that. Sorry about that. We have a narrative that just describes the characteristics of the population and how it's changed over the decade. And then if you zoom in, you can see, or if you look at the map tab, you can see there's a map that has population 2010, 2020, population change from 2010 to 2020, and percent change, and then information in the table about the race ethnic composition and change over the decade. A couple of other resources. One is that there's been some concerns about this 2020 census because of the pandemic and numerous other challenges that have risen over the course of trying to conduct the census. The Census Bureau takes quality very seriously. They have a plan for assessing the quality of the 2020 census. And so they're working with people outside of the Census Bureau, so they're opening up information to outside experts to help them assess issues of quality. Within the Census Bureau, they'll be spending time looking at census operations to see what went well, what went according to plan, and where did things go off, and we'll make an effort to describe that. And then they'll also be spending time looking at census counts relative to their own population estimates, as well as other independent estimates of population size to, again, assess quality. I have seen and heard strong commitment to transparency and to communicating any issues about quality openly. And I believe that to be the case. So we'll see how that, again, plays out over the course of the releasing of data. The Census Bureau Director, the acting Census Bureau Director, has committed to, as data files are released, to also release any information they have that's relevant to the data files they're releasing about quality that they have at that time. And then as they develop additional quality indicators, releasing those. The Census Bureau will conduct what's referred to as a post-enumeration survey. Historically, that has been a fairly significant means to assess the quality of the census. That survey won't go into the field until sometime, I think this summer or later in the spring. And so they won't have the data back from that until probably sometime in the fall to be able to actually do those sort of comparisons. Another resource, given we were just talking about quality, is if a state or local government looks at the census count and has concerns and has some other source of data that would indicate that there's an undercount or perhaps an overcount, there's a process that's been established and has been in place for many, I think several decades at least, maybe for a long time, certainly since I've been involved in censuses, this count question resolution process, whereby a state or local government can provide evidence for what they think the true population is compared to what the census is. And if the evidence is consistent with what the Census Bureau standards are, and there's evidence of an undercount, the Census Bureau will make modifications to the census count in response to that. And so this is information about that process. And then finally, I'll just mention that I mentioned earlier the acting director of the census has yesterday put up, or I guess 2 days ago, put up a blog and really talking about where they are with the census. I didn't put the whole thing, but he's made an effort, I think, to be, again, transparent and to communicate what the difficulties are, what they're doing to address them, and again, their commitment to transparency and openness in the process. That concludes my comments and testimony at this time, Madam Chair, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you, committee members, or other senators may have.
All right, does anyone have any questions? Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Potter.
Thank you.
Okay, this is ours.